Island hopping in World War II, fueled by U.S. drive to end Japan's reign of influence over the Pacific theater due to their attack on Pearl Harbor, caused them to invade Japan through island hopping and utilize their military to cut off supply lines, capture specific islands, and get closer to the capture of the main Japanese island.
Pearl Harbor. The first battle in the campaign took place in the early morning of December 7, 1941, in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japan wanted full access to all raw materials in its nearby area and viewed the American Navy as the final obstacle needed to overcome. Tensions between the U.S. and Japan had been rising ever since Japan invaded China. The United States extremely underestimated the willingness of Japan to wage a war. The huge overlook from the Americans left them extremely vulnerable to a surprise attack. In just a few hours, Japan successfully carried out one of the most damaging surprise attacks in all of history. Battleships were completely destroyed before being of any help to the U.S., and hundreds of planes were destroyed. 2,400 Americans also lost their lives. What Japan intended as a strong show of power to convince the United States to not interfere with their affairs utterly backfired, resulting in the U.S. dropping their neutrality and going to war the very next day. Pearl Harbor was the definitive start to the war in the Pacific theater.
Only 6 months later, the Battle of Midway shifted the course of the Pacific War. Japan had planned to lure American carriers into a trap and seize Midway Atoll, but the United States codebreakers cracked Japan's communications. Knowing this, the U.S. Navy was able to turn the trap around. In a couple of minutes, American dive bombers had destroyed 4 of the frontline Japanese aircraft carriers. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Equally as important, the Japanese had lost its most skilled naval aviators who were unable to be quickly replaced. From then on, the Japanese were pushed permanently into the defensive, and the United States would choose the battles with the strategy of island hopping that emerged. The U.S. launched its first major counteroffensive in August 1942, which was the Battle of Guadalcanal. The island was important due to it coming from its nearly completed Japanese airfield, which had threatened routes between the U.S., Australia, and the rest of the Allies. Guadalcanal was quickly turned into one of the most brutal of the campaigns in the Pacific War. The Marines had fought in dense jungles, starvation, heat, enduring disease, and constant night attacks. The nickname of the water around the island was Iron Bottom Sound, due to the amount of ships that had been sunk there. Initially, Japan's navy had held the advantage, especially in the nighttime battles. Through this, the U.S. lost many valuable ships like the cruiser USS Atlanta and even high-ranking naval commanders that had died in the combat. The Americans kept adapting, using radar-directed gunfire and relentless industrial replenishment to regain their momentum. Guadalcanal helped to prove that Japan could be beaten on land, at sea, and in the air. It had marked the real beginning of the island hopping strategy. Island hopping soon became a calculated campaign of selective conquest led by General MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Admiral Nimitz in the Central Pacific. Instead of assaulting every Japanese stronghold, the U.S. forces targeted islands that were defended lightly and strategically positioned. These islands actually served as air bases for launching bomber and fighter planes, staging grounds to prepare for future attacks, and even blockades to stop any Japanese advance. As the United States captured island after island, Japan had even less space. Every time another island was captured, the Japanese supply lines struggled, and troops became even more deprived of fuel, food, and reinforcements.
Leyte Gulf was one of the bloodiest naval battles that absolutely decimated the Japanese Navy. In 1944, it was decided that the U.S. would go after the Philippine Islands next in their pursuit to the Japanese mainland. The Japanese did expect an invasion and had set up traps and decoys to give them an upper hand, but the sheer firepower of the U.S. through their battleships, carriers, and escorts gave them the upper hand instead. As a result, Japan was crushed and faced severe casualties with 4 times as many ships sunk by their navy that they would never recover from. This battle was also prominent as it introduced the first kamikaze or Japanese suicide attacks.
Operation Downfall. By 1945, the United States had reached the final stage of its Pacific campaign. The next step was Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The first step of downfall was known as Operation Olympic. Set to take place in November of 1945, the Allied forces would invade the southern island known as Kyushu and use it as the staging ground to regroup for the second phase. That second phase was called Operation Coronet, set for spring of 1946, and would have been the largest amphibious invasion ever, far surpassing that of D-Day, designed with the goal of taking control of Tokyo to force the Japanese to surrender. The creators of Downfall expected huge casualties from both sides due to how hard Japan had fought to defend other islands such as Okinawa. Millions of civilians would have likely lost their lives had the plan been carried out. But Downfall never actually took place due to the surrender of Japan in August of 1945, following the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The events that cost the lives of thousands of soldiers who fought through the harsh jungle with little to no food, wondering when the enemy would attack next, shows the cruelty of island hopping. Along with that, countless civilian losses occurred with villages and even cities destroyed, and families torn apart with intense battles such as Okinawa reaching 100,000 civilian deaths. The events of island hopping shook the Pacific theater and will never be forgotten.